Thank you, Jason. So good afternoon, everyone. Like Jason mentioned, my name is Meera. I'm working with Synopsys from the past 10 years. I work as a director for the secure development practice, which also owns the CI/CD practice. Um, when I joined, so let me start with my journey. So I'm not sure how many of you used cruise control, but that is how my journey started with CI/CD. This was almost in 2001, 17 years ago. And then slowly from cruise control, I moved to Hudson, which again is now part of Jenkins. And then moved again up, reviewed the very first book on continuous integration. So all these years, I was just doing development. I had no idea about what it meant to write secure code. So in 2008, when the economy was going down, the company I was working for closed. And then I had to interview with a company called Cigital. I see many here who are customers of Cigital. So when I went to the interview, the first thing they asked me was, do you know OWASP Top 10? And I had never ever heard, even though I had developed for almost 12, 13 years, I had never heard about OWASP Top 10. So I told them, I have no clue what OWASP Top 10 is. I am a Java developer. I am a .NET developer. I lost my job yesterday. So if you want to hire me, you can. So they took a risk. They hired me anyway. This was in 2007, end of 2007. And slowly, I started learning what it meant to develop secure code. So I started reviewing what was OWASP Top 10. I traveled a lot to the West Coast. I am in the DC area. Did a lot of code reviews, even with code which was written in COBOL. Almost 1 million lines of code. So did a lot of code review, moved up, did a lot of architecture risk analysis because I knew a lot about technology, I knew a lot about frameworks. So every time I went and talked to someone, I was like, I don't like this job in Cigital. I don't want to do security. Who is the one who wants to break the code? That was always going through my mind because I was a builder. I was not a breaker, right? So slowly and steadily, I had to work. So I worked. I kept working. And every day, I kept thinking, OK, I'm getting a lot of job offers. We all heard about it today, right? I'm going to leave tomorrow. And then that tomorrow never came. And then almost in 2012, when CI/CD, even though CI was there for many, many years, security was not part of your CI or CD, right? So around 2012 was when a lot of clients from Cigital and now Synopsys started thinking about doing security in their CI/CD pipeline. And then that is when I saw my potential, since I had done a lot of CI/CD. And then in 2018, early 18, and then late 2017, I don't see CloudBees here. CloudBees recognized me as a woman in DevOps, leader in DevOps. And then Synopsys recognized me as a woman in engineering and technology, and then profiled me on USA Today. You know? So for someone who never knew what security was, I speak at a lot of conferences. And then one of the topics that I talk about is threat modeling. And then recently, with all of the CI, CD, and DevOps picking up, one of the things that we have done within my team is to take how you do threat modeling and integrate that in your CI, CD pipeline. So that's what we are going to talk about today. So the thing, when you see here, many of you might have seen the software security touch points, right? So from the time you write your requirements and use case, we always ask you to write abuse cases, right? So this is how an attacker or a hacker is able to abuse your system. The next thing we ask you is to write security requirements. And then the third thing that we do is to actually do risk analysis, which threat modeling is a part of, right? So when we say risk analysis, you need to understand what is in your system that you are developing, right? And then once you do that, you have your test plans. That's where you write your risk-based security tests. Then you do your code review. You use a lot of static analysis. There are a lot of tools out there. Synopsys has a tool called Coverity. So in the entire life cycle, if you see, Synopsys has a lot of products. And then again, once you finish all your code, you're ready to deploy. There are a lot of clients who, again, want to perform risk analysis and do an updated threat model. And then your code goes to production, right? So this is the journey of how your code goes from start to finish all the way. So where is it that we fit threat modeling, right? So you have two places where we talk about threat modeling. Once when you're building your system, and then the next thing is when you are actually ready to deploy your system to production, right? So what do we actually mean by threat modeling? So all of you want to do security. One of the things that I always hear is, yeah, we have the development team, we have the operations team, but then any time we start doing security, it brings down the velocity with which we can deploy to production. Because without security, your velocity might be, maybe you're deploying like twice a day, and your pipeline might be taking, 20 minutes? But then as soon as you bring in any of the security tools, right, whether you're doing static analysis, you're doing software composition analysis, you're doing dynamic analysis, each and every one of these tools take like 40 minutes, 50 minutes, 4 hours, maybe 8 hours, right? Because like one of the speakers talked today about how all of the applications are written in Java. Most of the clients I work with are financial institutions, big banks, insurance industries. All of them have code written in Java. So when you run any of your security tests, whether it is any of these activities, they take anywhere from 20 minutes to almost 20 hours. So your pipeline without security was taking 20 minutes. And then now when you included security, it's slowing you down, all right? So one of the things that I came up with is to look at what you do, you look at your threat model, and see what activities to run in your pipeline, right? So again, one of the key things here when you talk about threat modeling is to see what are the weaknesses in your architecture or in your application, right? You want to see what are the controls which are missing. You want to identify what are the controls which are weak. So I think when one of the gentlemen talked about United, he said that they took, 3 or 4 characters of your password. So we have heard so many issues about all of the ways how passwords are stored, right? So the way you do when you do your threat model is you identify where the weaknesses are. And you also identify what vulnerabilities exist in your application. So how do we do this threat model, right? So I always say a picture is worth 1,000 words. When I talk to all of my clients, yes, they have a lot of inputs. All of them are either in Word documents or Excel spreadsheet. So if we have to ask them, what are the assets in your application, no one has an idea what assets they have. So when I say assets, it's like, okay, you have a database. That's an asset. You have credentials for your Amazon AWS. That's an asset. You heard about all of those getting stolen, right? You store all of these AWS credentials in your Git, and you open source your Git, right? Many people do that. So there are a lot of things which are assets which you need to protect. So when you have all of these assets either in a spreadsheet or in a Word document, no one can use it. So what we do at Synopsys is to build something like this, which is called as a complete threat model, which shows you all of the assets, which shows you all of the controls that are in place, and it also shows you where the attackers are with respect to your application, right? So they might be someone who is internal, they might be someone who is external, or they might be someone who is a partner, right? So how do we start building this threat model? Yes, yeah, it's very nice. You saw a very nice picture. But how do we actually build this threat model, right? So we take 5 simple steps. The first one is to define the scope and how deep do you want to go, all right? Because anytime you want to build a threat model, you can go deep into the weeds, right? Because, yeah, you have an application built using Spring MVC, but then maybe you're dealing with credit cards, so you have a third party where you send your credit card information. Do you want to include that? You're doing authentication and authorization with a third party. Do I want to include that? Right? So you want to understand and define the scope and how deep do you want to go when you're building this threat model. The next thing is you need to understand what am I threat modeling for, right? So the way you threat model for a web application is completely different from the way you do a threat model for a cloud deployed application. So you need to understand, or if that application is written using microservices. So once you understand what application you're threat modeling, you model the attack possibilities. So you look at, okay, where is the attack coming from? Where is the attacker located? What asset is the attacker going to steal? What controls are in place? And then the next one is when you look at the threat model and say, okay, is there any control which is protecting my asset? Is this control enough? Is it not enough? Because there might be certain assets where you need 2 or more controls. And then last but not the least is you create a matrix. And this matrix is the one which helps all of your security activities, whether you want to do code review, whether you want to do a penetration test, whether you want to do a software composition analysis. You can look at this traceability matrix and decide how do you want to perform all of these security activities so that it can scale to the next level. So again, when we talk about this, how do you define the scope? Again, one of the key things we talk about is you need to go talk to your stakeholders, find out how risky is this application. Say, suppose your application is outside facing and you deal with a lot of credit card information. Then maybe you need to do a detailed threat model for that. Whereas there might be an application which is internally deployed within your intranet, maybe you don't need to spend that much time, right? So once you define the scope, the next thing is you're going to understand what is it that you're going to threat model. So how do we do this? The one thing we do is gather all the documents. So we talk to the requirements team, we talk to the business team, we want to talk to the operations team. How is this application deployed? How are you securing the application? We want to look at the user guide. We also interview a lot of different teams to understand what the application is actually doing. And then once you understand the system, we draw a very simple threat model on your whiteboard, right? So you define all the components. You say, okay, I have a partner store, I have a UI, I have a database, I have a payment system. This one is deployed in the data center. This one is deployed in my intranet. So you keep on adding, and then you also define all the protocols that is used. So you say, yeah, when my payments is talking to my data center on the back end, it's using JDBC. When my UI is talking to my application server, it uses HTTPS. So you keep on building this, and then once you have this, you next model the attack possibilities. So how do I do that? So again, here you look at all of the assets. So one of the key things is maybe your session ID, right? So that's an asset. Your database access credentials. We have seen in many, many clients where all of these database credentials are hard-coded in the code, right? So you want to make sure that you use that. Your customer profiles, you want to make sure that that is protected. Your partner credit API. So all of the things which are either code or which you store within your application are part of your assets. So you keep on identifying all of the assets that are there within your application. Once you define all of your assets, you want to see all of the controls that are in place. So there might be certain which require only one control, but then say, for example, you have a payments database, you might need access control for the database itself, and then you also need control within your code to protect against SQL injection. So you want to make sure that any time you keep drawing all of these controls, you want to make sure that, yes, this control which I have here has one, this asset has one control, which is more than sufficient, whereas this other asset, which is really critical for me, I don't want an attacker to get access to that, has 2 or more controls. And once you identify your assets and your controls, then you look at all of your threat agents. So we don't differentiate here between just the outside threat, because a lot of times there are attacks which have happened within an organization. So you want to make sure that's what you see there, the 4 threat agents that we have. You have external authenticated user, and then many times you have unauthenticated user, and then you also have a malicious user, and 04 you see as a system admin, right? Because that is when you want to see that you have a lot of monitoring, you have a lot of auditing within your organization in order to see that someone is not maliciously stealing things within your organization. So once you have all of these things, the next thing you do is interpret the threat model. So what do I mean by that? So you keep looking at each, and if you go back here, you look at each one of those. You have TA01, you have TA02, all of these are the threat agents. Is any of these threat agent able to get to an asset without going through a control, right? So the reason we build this picture is it's so easy to walk through the whole diagram and say, yes, there are all these assets for which there is no control at all, right? So you keep looking at each and every one of your assets. Some of your assets might be very high risk, some might not be so high risk. So based on the risk of your application, you define how many controls you want for that asset, and then you also keep checking to see if there's any asset that has no control an attacker can get to, right? So once you do that, you will be able to look at all of the controls that are in place, and then what we do is we give this threat model to your security team, right? Because if there is a team who is performing code review, manual code review, then we give it to them and say, okay, here are all the assets. See if you can find any security defects wherein an asset can be stolen, right? So you can give this threat model to your penetration testing team and ask them, can you do a pen test to get to my payment system without any authentication or authorization, right? So having this diagram is the one which will help all of your security activities in your SDLC. So the next thing we do is create this traceability matrix. So the reason we build this is you keep adding all of the threat agents. You add all of the assets that can be compromised. You actually add what the attack is and where the attack surface is. Maybe it is web-facing, maybe it is your intranet, maybe it is your cloud. And what is the goal of the attack, right? Why does someone want to do this? Why do they want to steal credit card information? Why do they want to steal partner information? And then what is the impact, right? to your organization. And then the last one is the control. What controls do we have in order to mitigate this attack, right? So once you have this, you will be able to look at all of the different types of attacks that are possible within your organization. So most of the places we see, everyone is focused on the OWASP top 10. So you don't even have a web application. Why are you worried about OWASP top 10? You are talking about microservices. You're talking about REST services, right? So this is where it will help you to think beyond your canned attacks, right? So the next thing is you identify the top N list within your organization. So don't get focused on the OWASP top 10. Look at what is maybe Synopsys top 10, Bank A top 10, right? So whatever is top 10 for the entire industry might not be the top 10 within your organization, right? So look at those, and then also identify where your threat agents are with respect to your architecture, right? So if you have a web services, it's completely different. If you have a web application, the architecture is different. If you have a cloud application, the architecture is different. So look at all of the different architectures and build your threat agents. And then you also will have an ability to look at the threat model and then identify the components that need additional protection, right? So yes, all of this is well and good, but how do I use this threat model in this conference, right? This conference is all about DevOps, CI/CD. And all I talked about until now is doing threat model, which is a manual activity, right? So how do I build this? So one of the things that we have done in my team is to write pre-commit checks. I think there were two gentlemen who talked about Git today. So Git is a very good example of how you can write pre-commit checks, either on the client side or on the server side. So what we did was we completely digitalized the threat traceability matrix. And then we look at what are the assets, what are the controls which have changed in this release which is going into production. So if there is no change in code, you just changed maybe one open source component, do I still need to do a code review for that? Maybe not. Maybe I just need to do software composition analysis. Maybe there was change in authentication and authorization API. I cannot find those issues by doing a code review. Maybe I need to do a dynamic analysis or a penetration test, right? So what our pre-commit checks does is it looks at your bill of materials and then it triggers all of these out-of-band activities. There are different ways. In one organization, we were able to completely stop the developer from checking in the code, whereas there are a lot of organizations, even though we talk about DevOps and Sec, all of them coming together, there is no culture of coming together. We heard about that today in the morning, right? So the DevOps is in its own place, and then the security team is sitting somewhere silo in some other place, right? So when we talk saying, hey, we are going to stop you from checking in code, we are going to break the build. I am a big proponent of breaking the build for security issues. Many clients don't like that, right? So that's where you have, especially when you're doing pre-commit checks, you can trigger all of these out-of-band activities. The next thing we did is, again, you have a lot of other activities which you do during commit time, build time. There is a Synopsys software confidence tool that we wrote, which is able to look at all of the results and say, something doesn't look good here. The pipeline is progressing, yes, we know, but then something doesn't look good. We pause the pipeline and we notify, do you want to do a threat model at this point? Because your developer changed in API for authentication and authorization, which was not reviewed at all, right? So all of the places where you look at a CI/CD pipeline, you need to build intelligence into the pipeline in order to trigger all of these out-of-band activities, right? So that's what you see here in the next one. So you see the developer is writing a lot of code, they check in a lot of code, and then especially for version controls like GitLab and Bitbucket, it's very easy to write pre-commit checks. So you know what is being checked in, you know what has changed, you know whether a dependency has changed, and based on that, you either fail and stop the developer from checking in the code, and then start saying, okay, we need to perform these out-of-band activities, or yes, the developer had successfully committed the code, and then your CI/CD pipeline kicks off. So this is as left as you can shift, right? Because once your pipeline starts running, and then you start running all of your tests, whether it is for security or for quality, if there is no intelligence built in, the code will almost go to either your staging environment or production environment, right? So what you need to make sure is everyone likes that word, shift left, right? So this is almost as left as you can shift, right? Because you have all these pre-commit hooks, you have developed a nice comprehensive threat model which has identified all the assets, all the controls, all the threat agents. So anytime a developer checked in a new asset or checked in a new control, you need to look at what has changed and then trigger appropriate out-of-band activities, or maybe pause the pipeline once the pipeline has progressed, right? So what do we do from here, right? So we always say that there is always light at the end of the tunnel. So when we talk about security, everyone assumes it's a dark hole. I don't want to build security in. I don't want to run all of these tools. They take a lot of time. They don't allow me to deploy like in 2 minutes or 2 seconds. But then you need to look at your threat model and say, what activities are appropriate? So you need to look at what is the architecture of your application, what are some of the assets, what are some of the controls, how do I make sure that I am actually testing each and every activity based on my threat model, right? So again, once you have your threat model, it makes you think like a bad guy or a gal, right? Because I always said bad guy, and then in one of the conference, there were like few people who raised their hand in the Q&A. I asked, what's the question? They were like, why are you always referring as bad guy? Why can it not be a girl? I was like, yeah, it can be either a guy or a girl, right? So you want to make sure that you use your threat model in an effective way to trigger the appropriate activities in your CI/CD pipeline. So based on the risk of your application, based on the bill of materials, what's going in your pipeline, based on what changes are going in your pipeline, we have actually built a model where you have a dynamic pipeline. So it picks and chooses what activities need to run, and then maintains your SLA. So if you say, Meera, I have 2 hours where you need to run all of your security activities, I work with you to see, okay, what activities can I fit within 2 hours in your CI/CD pipeline for security. So that is one of the talks I submitted for Jenkins World. Let me see, fingers crossed, whether they accept it or no. If not, it'll be a white paper which all of you can download. So how do you build a dynamic pipeline based off the threat model, right? So how do you look at what are the assets which were changed, what were the controls which were changed, what are the threat agents which were changed, and then based off of that, how do I trigger, you still run all of your quality activities, but then when it comes to security, I decide what security activity do I need to trigger and make sure that my pipeline and then my code, which is going to production, is secure enough, right? So I don't know how many minutes I have. I think that's all I have. So if you have any questions, I am very active on Twitter, very active on LinkedIn. Let me know. I don't know whether I should say this or no. I didn't want to be a US citizen. I was very proud of being an Indian citizen, even though I was in the US for 20 years. But then the 2016 elections changed my mind. And then immediately I went and got my US citizenship. So that's when I changed my name from Meera Subbarao to Meera Rao. So yes, now I can say anytime I travel outside the world, I can say, yes, I am a US citizen, I can come back. Even though I had a green card for many, many, many years, I was always nervous. Will I be allowed to enter into the country? So that was a new threat agent, right? So the attack surface was new. And so we had to become, I had to become Meera Rao. So yeah, if you have any questions, if you want the slide, I can share it with you. Just send me an email, and then I'll be happy to answer all your questions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Let's just move on. All right, thank you so much, Meera.